back again, and I just want to quickly say that we are going to move on into another topic which I think will be very interesting, which is the more historical aspect of the history of Canada. And I think Peter has something to say about his first experience, which will be a very good lead-in to the story of the Hudson's Bay Company. Peter?
As many other Chinese new immigrants did, the first week after we landed in Canada, in Vancouver, we took a quick tour to those several places. One place impressed me a lot is Stanley Park, for the reasons because it's in the downtown Vancouver, pretty close as in the cold place as like Central Park to New York City. And the other one is a numerous like huge trees, big tall trees over there, which we don't have in China. And first time I saw the totem pole. Before landed in Canada, I never saw totem pole in elsewhere, even though I made a trip to Australia and Africa already. So it was very impressive me.
What struck in your mind when you first saw them? Did you have any idea what it was, and what struck you about them?
Honestly, I didn't expect a so big one. It's taller than a normal tree, right? In Stanley Park, the huge.
Oh, 30 or 40 meters high. Yeah, or
40 meters high.
Yeah, quite high, quite high. Yeah.
Yeah, that's way beyond my imagination.
Right.
And I didn't have any knowledge behind this. What it is because the only notion I bear in my mind is through my elementary school is Eskimos. That's only original people I knew before immigrating to Canada.
So you're telling me, in essence, that your first exposure to native peoples of North America was the Eskimo, which are in the high Arctic. And Eskimo now are known as Inuit. That is the Aboriginal name of people who come from the far north. They're known as Inuit. So the word Eskimo is a Caucasian terminology rather. So your exposure was only to Eskimo.
Yeah, that's all I knew before moving to Canada.
Okay. So having said that, I think what will be really interesting would be for us, you're talking about the Inuit, or the Eskimo in your terms, is the history of the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, had you ever heard of the word Hudson's Bay?
I heard it before, but I can memorize that Hudson River. That is
In New York.
In New York.
In New York,
maybe
the Hudson.
Hudson Bay is in Hudson River Delta. But I never heard of Hudson Bay Company.
Okay. Well, what is very interesting for you to learn is that the Hudson's Bay Company at one point held 1/3 of the area, the square kilometers of Canada. And this was 1/3 of the size of Canada, and this was a company that was given a royal charter by King Charles II in 1670, has the Hudson's Bay Company. Did you know that?
No, totally beyond my imagination. 1/3 of the area.
1/3.
Which Canada is now. Yes.
1/3 of the area of Canada. So it would encompass, and you'll see that in our on our web page, you will see the map that will show you not only the flag of the Hudson's Bay Company, right, which included, of course, the Union Jack, which is the flag of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, and also the map of the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, the Royal Charter of 1670 by King Charles II said that the demarcation, the boundaries of this Hudson's Bay Company would encompass the whole drainage basin, meaning all the rivers that flow into Hudson's Bay are the Hudson's Bay Company. So this meant that 1/3 of Canada was the Hudson's Bay Company.
Wow, unimaginable.
It is unimaginable. And if we are to go back a few steps now and say that the people who discovered this area, and just as a note of reference, the exploitation or the exploration of Hudson's Bay Company was based upon beaver pelts, beaver fur,
Beaver
right?
fur.
Which in Europe was the thing to wear, right? Right now, it's Canada Goose, right? Well, in those days, in the 16th and 17th century, in England, it was beaver. People wore beaver. So the higher quality beaver pelt brought in the highest money. So explorers who were helped by the First Nations, in this case, it was I believe the Algonquin and the Huron Indians helped two people, explorers, who were from French Canada called Robespierre and Cournoyer, who through the guidance of Huron First Nations guides, helped them discover what the First Nations called the Great Cold Lake. And the Great Cold Lake was Hudson's Bay.
Hudson Bay. Because it froze in the wintertime.
Exactly.
I'm curious to ask, Peter, if you allow me. Do people in Canada nowadays still wear those beaver products?
No, because there is what we call an Endangered Species Act. The beaver is a protected species, right?
Nowadays they
It
almost
is.
extinct.
It is. I mean, what happened to the buffalo also in some measure happened to the beaver, where the buffalo, as you know, which roamed North America, specifically in Western Canada, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and down in the United States, the North and South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, and I believe they went as far south as Kansas. They were basically hunted almost to extinction. So if you go to Yellowstone or if you go to national parks in Alberta, they are a protected species, and it is against the law to kill them, right? Because the beaver was exploited. But the story of the Hudson's Bay is that it was able to continue as a company exporting beaver pelts to Europe until well into the late 18th century. And then eventually the Hudson's Bay Company became a store because the store came from a trading post, right, where the fur trappers would come and exchange the fur for provisions or money.
Yeah, I still
right?
found some trading posts in those remote areas in the western part of the United States.
Exactly. What happened is a lot of Canadian cities were at one point trading posts run by the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, Hudson's Bay Company, right? And over time, what happened, and then eventually Canada became a nation in 1867. So the idea of a company owning so much land became a non-issue, right? It became ridiculous. So eventually, when Canada became a country in 1867, and Manitoba joined the Confederation, and then BC joined the Confederation after the construction of the railroad, then the Hudson's Bay Company itself dissolved and became the store. It was Hudson's Bay Company Store, and then they abbreviated it and called it the Bay. The Bay. And actually, what you can do is if you go to the Bay or Hudson's Bay, because they abbreviated it to make it more marketable, you can still find the traditional Hudson's Bay blanket, right? Which I think you know of.
The white, red, and the yellow.
That's right. Yeah, it's a rainbow, right? It's a white blanket. That is the traditional Hudson's Bay blanket. And the Hudson's Bay coat, which is a coat which has little knobs that you close. And that's with a big hood. So I hope that's given you an appreciation of the role that the First Nations played in the development not only of Canada, but also the development of the Hudson's Bay Company and the fur trade, which at that time was the biggest revenue generator for the colonies at that time, which was the fur trade, exporting to Europe, primarily to France in the beginning and then England after.
Thank you, Peter. It's a very interesting story. Most Chinese new immigrants saw Canada is the only history with 150 years also. But Hudson Bay Company has a history of 350 years.
And then some.
Way longer than the Canada itself.
Yeah.
And China claimed itself has a history as a civilization of 5,000 years. But we don't have even one company have a company longer than 200 years. The longest one, I think, in my knowledge, is called Tongren Tao, a pharmaceutical selling traditional Chinese medicine.
Which would make sense.
Yeah.
Which would make sense.
So
Yeah.
it shows how great the Hudson Bay Company is. Also show how Canadian people are nice, because the dissolve process of Hudson Bay shows Canadian people are love to tend to give, to share.
Yeah. I just want to add one brief thing, is to tell you that the history of Canada is not only the history of immigration, but it also the history of First Nations. The First Nations had been in North America or in Canada at least, they say, for 12 to 15,000 years.
Wow.
So if you're saying that North America does not have a lot of history, you have to make sure that you define what exactly that you mean. The history of immigration to Canada is 350 years, but the history of First Nations, which include all the various First Nation tribes, be it the Huron, Iroquois, or Haida or Cree, or Micmac, or Algonquin, and the Inuit, which are the ones that live in the high Arctic, because they are cousins, you're talking about 12 to 15,000 years.
Wow. Usually we limit our knowledge to those short history of the great discovery of geography from Caucasian people from Europe to find the whole.
That's right. And we
American
ourselves as immigrants to Canada, we have to, especially in the last couple of years, have been made aware that the history of North America is not only the history of immigration, but the history of the First Nations, the First Peoples, who settled in North America, had their own society, their own laws, their own hierarchy, their own architecture, their own religion, which was based on Mother Earth. And this is true of the First Nations in the southern part, and is also true of the Inuit, who speak Innu in the high Arctic of Canada.
Great to know that.
Yeah, it is interesting.
We should respect it.
Yeah, so your trip to Stanley Park was a road to discovery.
Okay, I want to take more destinations in the future.
Good, good. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.